All right, so good evening. My name is Colin Diaz. I'm the President and CEO of the Culver City Chamber. I am joined by Acting Chief of Police Manuel Cid, Mayor of Culver City Goran Erikkson, and Summer McBride. I will let them give a better introduction of themselves. But I wanted to start with the importance of this conversation. Obviously, what's going on locally and nationally over the last several weeks and for many years. This has been a topic of conversation, and I've had individual conversations not only with the folks here that you see on this panel, but many of you in the community, both residential and business side, and just felt that it was a important step or opportunity the Chamber had to convene this type of a meeting. So our goal today is really to have a conversation in regards to decoding what defund the police, what the movement means, what would it look like, what are some of the elements, what are things that are currently being done in the city, what has been done, and then hopefully have a little bit more of a dialogue into what might be able to be done collectively. I'll start by saying, for many of you, you guys have known me in my role for the last 3 years, just about. Before coming to Culver City, I was at another chamber, but I've grown up for the most part, born in Miami, lived out of the country for a little bit, but I've pretty much been Southern California born and raised, and so I've had many encounters on the topic, both positive and negative. And so I think one of the areas that I wanted to touch on today was, listening to the council meeting on Monday and hearing the overwhelming input from the community, both in support of the police force as well as in support of reform or complete overhaul. It just spoke to the fact that A, this is a very important topic, and B, that there's much work to be done. What the end result will look like and what's best for all of us in Culver City is going to take all of us collectively. So with that, we'll kind of go around the horn for an introduction and just general thoughts on why this topic is important. So let's go to our Mayor, Goran Erikkson, if you don't mind unmuting yourself.
Yeah, hi. Well, my background is born in Sweden. I came to the United States when I was 27 years old, and been here in LA area the whole time, Culver City for 34, 35 years. And I was elected to City Council in 2016 and was elected mayor just 1.5 months ago. It's been a rather interesting time to be mayor. There's been a lot of stuff going on every day. And as you said, Colin, on Monday we had a discussion about the police department and everything around that with budget and what they do and what they don't do and what they should do and not should do. And we're going to come back to that. But it was a very diverse, and I don't think we have had that was over 200 when we had the written comments. It was over 200 people who engaged and either wrote or had oral comments. So this is an issue that engaged people of all ages, all different political persuasion. It's cuts through the whole community. So it's a very timely issue to talk about.
Thank you, Mayor. Let's go to Summer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Summer McBride. I am the president of the Culver City School Board, but I have to let you all know that I am not here representing the Culver City School Board. The opinions and statements that I make are really expressions of my own thoughts and feelings about this topic. I am a 12-year resident in Culver City. My husband and I have 5 sons who are all in Culver City schools. I have 2 high schoolers, 2 middle schoolers, and a first grader. This topic is personal interest of mine because we are a Black family. My husband is also a police officer, and just on the surface, a lot of people may make assumptions about where we stand on this topic, but it is something that's more nuanced for us. And people may be surprised at some of my opinions about law enforcement and how critical I am of the work that they do, the importance of it, but also the way in which it's performed. Because I look at life through the lens of my 5 Black sons. And as a mother, it is a different kind of emotion that you experience when you see things unfolding and you can't really make sense of it for yourself, let alone your children. So I'm honored to be here to engage in this discussion. In my day job, I serve as a assistant director of a parenting program for a nonprofit community clinic in Glenwood. So I teach parenting classes. Most of my clients are mandated by the court to complete a series of parenting classes. And I also work with a couple group homes teaching parenting classes to formerly incarcerated women. And I've spent the last year going into the Glenwood Women's Facility teaching currently incarcerated women. And so that's helped shape my perspective on the overall justice system in this country. And it does play into my opinions on a local level about what I envision for policing in our community. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you for joining us. And Acting Chief Cid.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me on. It's my pleasure to be a part. As of about a week ago, I was appointed the acting police chief. It's an opportunity I'm really excited about. Honored to be, a part of leading the women and men of this police department, and more importantly, I think a part of this community, which I've been lucky enough to be a part of for the last 15 years working here at this department. A little bit about me. I come from an entirely Cuban family. My entire family was born in Cuba. I had the privilege to be raised the better part of my youth in the Long Beach area here in Southern California. Grew up with a fair amount of challenges and my own fair share of experiences with, I think, a lot of the issues that we're going to kind of speak to this evening, including interactions with law enforcement, both good and bad for that matter. I'm a father. I have 2 young daughters. So again, this conversation and some of the things I think we're going to be touching on, and I spoke to that on Monday at the council meeting, hit home for me on a lot of different fronts, obviously as a professional and being a part of the law enforcement community, but as a parent, as a first-generation immigrant, and just as a part of the greater community here in our region. These things hit home for me on a lot of fronts. It's something that I'm passionate about and want to strongly be part of the solutions kind of going forward. And as has been touched on by some of the other panelists, it's a multifaceted conversation, one that elicits a lot of emotions and feelings, understandably so. Some of those same emotions and feelings come from me when we touch on them. But again, I look forward to being a part of collaborating with a lot of different folks in this community in looking to address them, but with the ultimate goal of walking away with a better police department that's going to serve this community, and one that this community can feel proud, have confidence in, and feel the utmost of accountability and transparency with their police department. And again, a police department that everyone in this community can be proud of and feel good about. So again, thanks for having me on, and I'm excited about being part of the what's an amazing panel. Thanks.
Thank you. So first question, and we'll kind of switch up the order as we go through. When you hear the term defund the police, first, what are your thoughts, and what do you take that to mean? So we'll start with Summer, and then we'll go to our chief, and then to our mayor.
So I have to be honest, when I first heard defund the police, I didn't know what to think. I think it's part of the challenge that we have living in a hashtag society, where things are summed up in just a few words that are put behind a hashtag, and then they're spread like wildfire without a lot of understanding about what it really means. We don't give some of those things a lot of critical thought, and so you have this immediate response from the public where it's like half of them are immediately against it and the other are in favor of it without any context for what it really means. So for me, I had to really dig in and do some understanding about what that hashtag represented what the purpose of it was. And so when I, when I looked into it more, it actually made total sense. It's not something that's completely radical. It actually is exactly what we as a society should be aiming for, but that would be the end goal, not, necessarily where we are right now. So defund the police for me means divesting from law enforcement and reinvesting those funds into public services. And that's by way of education, healthcare, mental health, drug rehab, housing, all of the things that we know are a detriment to a healthy society, because people need these resources. These are the things that we need just to live, not even to thrive, but we need these things just to live. It's a basic need that people have to know where they're going to lay their head in a safe environment at night, or know that if they are not mentally well, that they can get the help that they need, or know that our public schools can provide counseling services and full-time nurses so that when children are injured, either physically or psychologically, they can get the support that they need. But right now we have budgets, either local, statewide, or nationwide, that disproportionately support reactive responses to situations as opposed to proactive responses to situations and the needs of the public. So to keep my answer as brief as possible and succinct as possible, because we have limited time, for me, hearing that term defund the police, it just simply means let's divert some of those resources to services that can actually prevent the need for officers to have to respond. Because I know from, like I said, being the wife of an officer, one of the scariest things you can respond to is something like domestic violence, or even a situation where you have a homeless encampment and you don't know what you're going to walk into. But there are people who can be better equipped to respond to those, so that it actually creates a safer environment, not only for the public, but also for our officers. Because my goal is to live in a society where everybody can make it out safely, where no one has to fear for their lives. And if we provide the right supports and services, and that comes in the form of money, because no matter what we talk about, everything comes down to where the money is being spent. Money and budgets are statements of value. So when we're saying we put a value on people's lives, we have to make sure that we're providing the resources with those dollars.
Thank you for sharing. So we'll go to you next, Chief, and just to get your feedback, and if you can also, to tag on to that response, paint a picture of what that might look like, as far as, I know you just mentioned a few minutes ago, your willingness to have the meaningful conversations and to dive deep to see really how do we come to a better, whether it's better community, better distribution of resources. So the initial question that we asked, but also what that would look like from a shifting of personnel resources, what that might look like internally.
Sure. Really, Summer nailed it as far as I'm concerned. In regards to the first part of the question, and what does it mean? Again, I think she's right on in how she detailed it and outlined it. The only thing I would add to that is, I think, ask, at least right now, maybe ask 10 different people, what defunding means to them, you might get 10 different answers. And even when I first heard it, and probably the initial response it elicited from me was defund the police. Like we don't need the police. We're going to abolish or completely cease having police, which obviously I personally would think is a mistake. But I've come to learn it and to understand it, and I get a different perspective on what I think the mass majority of our folks say, or what they're referring to when they say defund the police. And I think it really speaks to exactly what Summer was touching on, and I couldn't agree more. What that would look like, I think that's to some degree why we're here, and what needs to be fleshed out. Without question, we have things today that most of our modern day law enforcement agencies are doing throughout the country, in our region, and certainly in our city, that police aren't the best equipped to do or to deal with. And I think Summer touched on some of those things, some of those social services. Probably right at the top of that list is mental health and our unhoused and our homeless crisis. Those are things that, for various different reasons, and in my opinion, to some degree, some failures of our system, the greater system, has fallen to our local police departments. And I don't believe that the face of our homeless outreach and those mental health efforts should be the police department. Not to say that the police department shouldn't have some role in that, but it certainly shouldn't be the face of it. So I use that as a prime example, some of the things that I think that we need to kind of rethink and to some degree reimagine. And if with that comes the redistribution or the defunding of the police department to reallocate those funds somewhere else, I support that. Now, I think I certainly feel that any of those conversations and anytime you take any action, it's got to be something that's got to be measured, with some real consideration and done so in a thoughtful manner. Because I obviously, being a police officer and understanding the importance of public safety, there's an incredible value to what the women and men at a police department do and what they provide to their community. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be rethinking that and looking at it through a different lens on how we can do and provide their services better. And again, I provide the sample of mental health, and I think Summer touched on some of the other ones. I think as we go through that conversation, though, I think where the measured approach and the thoughtfulness and that multifaceted, deeper conversation comes with to what degree should our law enforcement professionals be a part of addressing some of these services? Maybe in some instances, not at all. I think in a lot of those instances, still need to be a part of that conversation or a part of that collaboration in addressing those services, probably just in a different role and certainly in a different capacity. And I think that's where there still needs to be some work done to figure out what that looks like. And if not our law enforcement officials and law enforcement professionals being the ones that deal with that, who is? And I know there's some ideas about what that looks like. I think some are great. I think some need some real fleshing out to understand how feasible they are, how safe they'll be for the people that are providing them. And then again, in turn, how will law enforcement, if at all, be involved in some of those things. So I think I'll stop there and let the mayor, chime in.
All right, Mayor.
Well, I think that both Chief and Summer has expressed very well what we need to do, what we need to look at. And your initial question about, what I was thinking, well, being an immigrant and not 100% sure about the language, I understood what defund means, but I wasn't sure that really was what people meant, because for me that was sort of, okay, we're going to take all the money away from the police. I even went to the dictionary to see if the word had multiple meanings, but it didn't. And then I had to start looking at it and realize that it was a reallocation of resources, but it wasn't getting rid of all the police. Well, I got a number of emails, trust me, that people basically say, get rid of the whole police department, period. But I also get a lot of emails saying, hey, we need to cut a certain percentage and move that money over to somewhere else and so on. So there is a lot of opinion of what it really means. What I subscribe to is that we need to review and look at what we do within our safety, both police and fire, because the fire department is also involved in a lot of the homeless issues and mental issues and so on. So as a city, we need to look at how we're going to deal with that with the resources we have. But the big gorilla in the room is really the county, because we need to figuring out how the county is going to come in and be more active in this, because that's, from what I understand, is more on, they have a mental health department, they have a health department, they have the housing, our Proposition H, the $500 million that has come in through sales tax has gone to counties, but nothing, very little, has come out to cities. So that has to be part of the discussion. One thing is that we need to refocus and reorganize how we do things, but the county needs to somehow come in here with their resources and actually start taking some responsibility for helping getting a handle on homelessness and getting a handle on all the mental issues we deal with. And coming from another country in Europe, there's a total different system how it's dealt with where I come from. But on the mental side, same thing happened in Sweden as here, that in the 80s they closed down all the mental institution and nothing else was put there to replace it as some kind of local support organization that is sort of not an institution, but is there, and you sort of are connected to one, and that's where you go and get your help and whatever is needed. Didn't happen in Sweden either. So it's actually the same problem over there, which is sort of fascinating to me. But I think there is a number of things that we need to rethink and look at with regards to what our police department do and how that could be done in other form. But I also think that the chief is making a point on that a lot of these situations, the police has some role to play or some function, but they shouldn't be the first one that actually enter the scene always. No, we have had a psychologist from the mental health department in the county that has been working with our police department, and we have trained the 2 officers specifically to deal with mental patients. And Dr. Dan, then, so he's out, and it doesn't really say police on him, and he, so he approaches, he engaged and so on. But there is officers there if things starts to go sideways, and I think that's a part that probably is going to be very hard to totally isolate the police from. So there is a very thoughtful process that's going to happen, and on Monday, the council is actually going to have a discussion about this and how we are going to start moving forward on these issues. So it's high on the agenda.
Thank you, all of you, for your answers. So the next question is going to be somewhat of a combined question. One of the questions that we got from one of our audience members has to do with the reallocation of funds, and more so the measurement of that. And I know at council, from the mayor and a few of your colleagues, there was a conversation about making changes but having them be measured. And I know that Summer had mentioned that before, and the chief as well. So from each of your own perspectives, how do you see, or what mechanism do you see being used to measure, where is the need? So obviously, social services, mental health, those are some of the other areas, homelessness, and there's a myriad of areas where there can be additional funds that are transferred to it. But what are some mechanisms that you see that we should use to measure, how much goes there and how much can also be extracted from, whether it be police, fire, other areas in the city? And let's start with the mayor on that one.
Well, I think that's what we're hopefully going to find out when we start this process. I don't really have a good idea there. I know that we gotten emails that says, well, Culver City, we has a higher number of police officers per capita or per 10,000, and therefore the first thing we could do is just go down to the LA level, and that would free up, it's somewhere around 20 positions that we would fire, I guess. But that's so arbitrary, because we don't know. I don't know what we're going to have as a result of really looking at this. First, we need to understand how much of the police resources are going to these issues, right? How much of the calls are there, and how much time is spent on all these issues where we believe that it's better to have a social worker or a professional of other kind to be the front person or the only person who deals with the situation. So the first is we have to start looking at both on we have a lot of these issues in the fire department also. You don't hear about it, but they also are spending a lot of time on mental and also homeless issues. So we're going to look at both and then see what it is. But I have no idea if it's a certain percentage or a certain dollar or what it is.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the chief, and then we'll round that question out with Summer.
Yeah, so I think like the mayor touched on, I don't know that there's a clear delineation of what that is yet. I think that's part of what has to be fleshed out and really worked on and take a good look at. I'll tell you that from the police department's perspective, obviously first and foremost, our number one concern, our number one priority is public safety, right? Is trying to provide a level of service, a high level of service at that. And I think that's something that this community enjoys. It's something that this police department strives to continue to provide through the areas of, having some of the best response times in our region. Our crime rates stay relatively low considering that we're in a large metropolitan area surrounded by the second largest city in the country, and we enjoy a really overall really safe city. We have traffic concerns that are ridiculous in and around this region. Our overall community outreach and our engagement with the community, which takes obviously resources and staff. And then, what we're experiencing now and the ability as a police department and as a public safety entity, whether it's between police and fire, to be able to respond to emergencies, large emergencies, whether it's a COVID pandemic, a natural disaster, civil unrest, those large types of incidents, being able to safely secure, the hosting of large events in and around our region, those sorts of things. And I say those things in that those are some of the things that as we go through and measure where we can, reallocate staff and personnel and ultimately funding from the police department, those are some of the things that we want to measure it against, in that those are the things that we want to still hopefully be able to continue to provide at a high level and hopefully not have sacrificed or significantly sacrificed in doing so. I will tell you that, in regards to mental health, that is absolutely something that has grown, and it's the amount of effort and the taxing on some of our resources has grown. I'll tell you that right now, probably on any given day, we average somewhere between 6 to 12 mental health related calls a day. As a department, we average one, what's referred to as a 5150, a psychiatric hold that is placed on oftentimes by our mental health team and Dr. Dan, or even in some instances, our line level and routine patrol officers on any given day. That's a significant amount of time. Right now, we currently have 2 police officers assigned to our mental health evaluation team. That's their primary focus. They work alongside Dr. Dan, essentially here 7 days a week throughout a good portion of each day, just dedicated, to that realm, if you will, of dealing with, public safety here in the city. So I think, as the mayor touched on, that's part of what I think we need to flesh out, is trying to find that sweet spot of how, how we can continue to provide that high level of service, not impact the things that I think should continue to be important, and I believe are important to many of the residents in the city, with things like response time, continuing to maintain a high level of safety and being able to deter crime and solve crime, being able to respond to emergencies and prepare for disasters and large emergencies or critical incidents, to do that with the least amount of people and the least amount of budgets possible, to be able to reallocate those funds to different areas to address some of these different social services. Drug addiction's another one that I think Summer had touched on. And I certainly don't have what that number is. I think that's going to be what we're going to have to work to flesh out and take a really deep dive and take a look at. But I think, again, not to beat a dead horse, but I think that's where you'll hear me talk about that measured approach. I think the worst thing that we can do and the biggest mistake we can make at this point going forward, I think action is important. I think we absolutely need to seize this moment, and that doesn't escape me, but I think it's got to be a measured action. I don't think we want to take action just for the sake of taking action and ultimately do more harm than good. And for lack of better words, cut our nose to spite our face going forward, and also have what I also feel is important, which is the safety of this community, be sacrificed. I think there is some movement to be done. I think it's got to be measured. And I think that's some of the things that we're going to have to take a deep dive and take a look at and start, taking some incremental steps to work towards, doing some of that defunding.
Thank you. Summer?
So when I hear the word measure, it's for me, like, how do we determine, how do we start this? How do we go about this? And then how do we determine if it's working or not? How do we evaluate it? And what do we evaluate it against? Because there aren't a lot of examples of policing being really effective across this nation. There are a few places that have been referenced, like Camden, New Jersey, and there are some areas where they did either defund or disband, the police department altogether, like in Compton, but then it was just replaced with another police force, essentially. And so the important part of this conversation for me is, where do we want to be, and how do we sort of reverse engineer that plan? What do we see for our community, and then how do we take some steps, some big steps, to get us to that point? And the measure of a healthy society is not really just in preventing, police brutality. It's not just in preventing, unnecessary or unwarranted stuff. It's an overall holistic approach to making sure that we have affordable housing, we have a safe way to commute, we have, an overall feeling of safety in the neighborhood. There's income equality, because that's a big piece of it. Our kids go to schools in not just Culver City, but in cities all over where they know that they're getting the best education they possibly can. And also there's a cross-sector approach to it, where it's not just pointing the fingers at one entity saying, you've got to fix this problem. If we divest from law enforcement and we reinvest into social services, and I think the mayor touched on this, we've got to make sure that those social services are going to be effective, because you can't just add money to a budget and expect systems to change. And so we have to really take a critical look at the systems that are in place for a lot of different institutions, not only policing, but also in education, in social services. We know that the Department of Children and Family Services, they handle a lot of cases, but they also have huge caseloads. So there have been times, and it's been in the news over the past years, where they've been investigated because, children have died after they have been sent to homes to investigate reports of child abuse. And that may not necessarily be on that one person, but it's on the system. And really, when we talk about law enforcement, it is not about individual officers. And I think it's an important point that I want to make, that this discussion about defunding police and changing the face of law enforcement is not targeting individual police officers. And I think that's where a lot of the defensiveness comes up when people have this discussion, because people who are in law enforcement individually take offense to that because they feel personally attacked. And I would caution all of us in this discussion to really take a broader look at the system of law enforcement, the same way I take a look at the system of education. I represent education. I represent the Culver City School Board. At the same time, I can be critical about the school district as well as the school system in this nation and say it's not working. It's not working because it was not designed explicitly for certain groups of students. The same can be said for law enforcement. And so when we're talking about measuring what that looks like in the future, start where we want to be. Don't be afraid to say, you know what, I can envision a society where we don't have a need for law enforcement. That may be a pie in the sky, unrealistic reimagining of our future. But if we start there and we work backwards and say, well, what needs will we need to meet in order to make sure that we have the minimum number of law enforcement officers out there on the street going after the true crimes, and every other need is being met by people who are not armed, who are not sworn officers, but are trained professionals in these areas. If we take that approach, I think we would surprise ourselves at how creative we can get, how innovative we can get about solving these some of these problems in our society that really just need a different approach. Everybody's heard the saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything is going to look like a nail. And so if we take a different approach and say, what do we want our society to look like? And we start there and start working backwards, and then being brave enough to put the funding towards those things, I think we'll start to see exactly how we can measure this. It can be measured quantitatively as well as qualitatively, because it is about, at the end of the day, the quality of life that we're providing for society.
Thank you all for your answer on that. I would like to add just one other component, because I think each of you touched on one piece of this, and in Summer, you kind of drove, no pun intended, but kind of drove the nail home on this one. Really, when you look at this item, how, I guess the universal question, because a lot of the role we play as a chamber is in convening, whether it be this type of a setting, whether it be in something that's just directly related to business. But ultimately, people are pretty passionate one way or the other about this topic, whether it's there needs to be some reform, it needs to start from scratch, things are fine the way they are. I think, I was part of about 90% of the Monday council meeting, and I'm sure the mayor remembers a lot more of the comments than I do, but the one thing that was ringing true was that there were very strong opinions and thoughts about what the future of Culver City should look like, whether it's, you know, a certain reduction size, whether it's reallocation of funds, whether it's, you know, people not wanting to change. Because I'll be honest, when I first started, the three things that people told me that was great about Culver City was, you know, police and fire response time, and the schools, the school district, and the fact that it was a small town feel. And, you know, having been here for 3 years, I can say that, you know, all of those elements I've seen. But I also heard from a lot of people on Monday night that have experienced a different Culver City. So the question that I have for everyone right now is, and maybe the pandemic is a great example of how to best go about this, but we have an item that needs, you know, needed a solution yesterday in terms of what we look like moving forward. You know, what does policing look like in Culver City? What does the funding look like? What are allocations of or support towards social services, health services? How do we go about having the meaningful conversations, something similar to what we're doing for the general plan update, and involving stakeholders that are from all different backgrounds, experience, and vantage points? How do we bring all of them together to make change that's necessary, but do so in a way that is going to be civil discourse? Because oftentimes when you're have a very strong opinion, it's easy to see a differing opinion as an attack. And I've been on pretty much every side you can be on a discussion, and I've found that when it's a combative conversation, you end up, you know, everybody walks away upset, but there's really not much that's done moving forward. So I'll start with you, Summer, because you kind of drove the last point home on that, and then we'll go to the chief and the mayor. But what do you see as, you know, next steps for having the right conversation, identifying? I think you mentioned it's important to identify what the needs are before you can even talk about measuring. You need to know what the needs are. How do we go about acquiring that? So what would be your next steps?
Well, one seemingly easy but not so easy first step would be to actually listen to each other. I think I've gone onto Facebook maybe once in the past couple weeks because I stay off from my mental health, from my own mental health. It's just not the best place to be if you want to engage in a real dialogue about these issues. And it's a very polarizing space. And I think that's been sort of the tragedy of this country in general, is that the history since the United States, since its inception, it has been a very polarizing country where there are people labeled as good and people labeled as bad, and that's the end of the story. And no one wants to have a real discussion about the truth in that and some of the nuance. And so I think the first step would be really starting to listen to each other and hearing one person's perspective as being, you know, their reality, even if it's not your own. And with this discussion about law enforcement and policing and police brutality, there is a history there that none of us can deny. And if you read any articles, if you look at any of the statistics, there are so many studies that, you know, I could direct any of us to show that, you know, more police officers in a neighborhood does not make that neighborhood safer. As a matter of fact, it has the opposite effect. And we've seen that in ghettos that have been created. And when I use the term ghetto, I am talking about going back to Warsaw, Germany. That's the original. That when we're talking about ghettos, that is what the United States has created over the history of this country in certain neighborhoods where there are limited resources, and the people there have been left to fend for those limited resources. And of course, that's going to generate crime. And so when you have neighborhoods across this country over the history of this country where there are limited resources, limited social services, but an increase in policing, the outcome is exactly what you expect: high crime and a lot of arrests. And it's important that we educate ourselves on the history of this country, not just on the history of policing, because there is a system. It's like, you know, bringing together all of the veins and blood vessels that run through your body. It's almost impossible to separate some things because they're so intertwined. But if you do any thoughtful study of the history of the United States, if you understand critical race theory or the history of race relations in this country, it'll actually start to make a lot of sense why certain groups of people are really tired and anxious for things to change. And you have this radical approach to getting things to change because people have been facing these same discriminatory practices or, police brutality for so many years. And again, it's not, this conversation for me is never really just about Culver City Police Department. It's so much bigger than that. It is policing and the history of policing in this country as it relates to race relations in this country. And so I think it's important that if we're really going to get anywhere in this conversation, we have to take a step back and educate ourselves and really find out how we got to this point. What was the beginning of law enforcement in this country? And in the South, it absolutely was the slave patrol. And if you look it up, you will find a ton of resources that explain to you that in the South, the original law enforcement officers were put in place to capture slaves who ran away. And so if you take that into account and you're an African-American person in this country and you know that part of your history, and then you're raised in families where they constantly tell you to avoid interactions with law enforcement. And there have been studies to show that the younger a Black male child is encountered by law enforcement, the sooner they are to sort of engage in deviant behavior because of that conditioning to make them think that this is what we think of you. And then kids begin to take on that, internalize that behavior and think that this is what they are. So it's sort of like this conditioning of making people think that they're inherently bad. And so you get a lot of that behavior that's playing out in, when schools rely on school resource officers to respond to things that a counselor or a nurse or a therapist should be responding to, that really does affect the student's self-perception. And there are tons of research that show that. So by seemingly wanting to make neighborhoods safe, we make them less safe, and we send the wrong message to the people who encounter law enforcement, and that begins the breakdown. And it goes back generations. So to start this conversation and to start moving towards these changes, we really have to educate ourselves and be willing to accept that someone else's perception of law enforcement may not be our own, but it is equally valuable. And if we're willing to put down our own understanding of law enforcement or our own preconceived notions of who's good and who's bad and really look into the history of it, I think that would be a great place to start. And once we start to educate ourselves and we face those truths, there's no way we can sort of turn a blind eye to that. But at the same time, sometimes people do know the truth. That's why policy is important.
Right.
You can't just expect people to change their opinions about something even when they're faced with the truth. And because of that, one of the things that I do as a school board member, city council members do it, or, Congress does it. They enact policies and procedures to protect the public when it is down to a microaggression or it is down to that, discriminatory policy that's hurting people. So it's a combination of educating the public while also putting policies in place that protect the public simultaneously.
I appreciate that answer. We're going to get back to part of yours in terms of policy, but I want to give the gentleman both the chance to answer the original question.
Yeah, just to kind of just add to really what Summer said, she really hit it. I think we start with, and she touched some on this, I think as a whole, when we get into this dialogue and get into this conversation, it's incumbent on all of us to suspend our assumptions. About each other, about a profession, about really anything. And that's a hard thing to do. It's easier said than done, but I think that's incredibly important in this conversation. Law enforcement, officers and people part of law enforcement need to suspend their assumptions about the community. I hope and that they need to suspend some of their assumptions about law enforcement and so on and so forth. So I think that's where it's got to start. And then we got to do a lot of listening. I know for myself, it's something that I've over the last week and I intend to do over the days and weeks to come over things. I need to do a lot of listening. I need to hear a lot of different perspectives, some that I've heard before, quite frankly, some that I haven't heard before. And there's value in all of them. And then from that, hopefully some dialogue. Another thing that I think Summer touched on, which I think is important, once we get to a place where we start enacting some action, is really that multifaceted approach. The idea that the best approach to take with everything is always, and I think that the analogy that's been used is the hammer. that's wrong. I don't subscribe to that idea at all. There's a time and a place, but I think any any good carpenter, has a bunch of tools on his tool belt. I think the hammer, more times than not, needs to be, last case scenario. Really no different than, for law enforcement, we go out, we encounter folks, we're doing our job. We get to a point that we have to use force. More times than not, that encounter, needless to say, is a failure. Now, sometimes it can't be avoided. We have to use that hammer, but that's a failure. That's never where we want to lead from. So I think that the idea of that multifaceted approach and that lead needs to be, whether it's with those services or that outreach, understanding that we have the hammer to our disposal, but that's got to be, for me, last case scenario. That's not, again, we don't want to lead with that. So again, I would just add what Summer's saying is that idea that when we get there, that it's got to be a multifaceted approach, and we have to be willing to rethink how we approach those things. And it certainly does not always have to be with the lead being, again, that hammer that we're talking about. So.
Thank you, Mayor. You're muted.
Yes, Summer touched on some of it in the sense that we need to understand where we are, currently, and if I just narrowly look at the city, so what we need to understand is really what we are doing. What is our different department doing? That's really where we need to start to understand this, and then from there we can then move up to see, okay, they should do something else. But right now, I don't think we on the council has a good idea of how much is our fire department involved, how much is our police department involved in certain things that we could have other resources involved. But I also think that it's because of where we are geographically, it's a regional issue, and somehow we need to engage our cities around us and the county. I think there is, especially from the county, need to be much more engaged in these discussions, because starting shifting resources from our end, if there is nothing that fills it from the county's end, we haven't really accomplished much, right? So this is going to be very complicated, and it's going to be we're going to have a dialogue, and and I really appreciate this discussion we have now, because I think it's hopefully fruitful for a lot of the people that's listening, how we could go forward. And we have a new acting chief that you see for the first time, I guess, a lot of you, so you hear what he's saying, and I know he represents the whole department and his assistant chief and others. So we are going to move forward on this, and we're going to work on this. But I also need to we need to figuring out how we can engage the county, and it's not the county and the sheriff's department. It's sort of the county and all their responsibilities for all these social services, because it's going to be a teamwork. And I don't necessarily see that we are going to build a lot of social services within the city. We don't really have the money for that. Even if we would close down the police department, the county has a lot of money for that, and we need to figure out how those money can be reallocated and come up with a much better system of prevention and taking care of people who are suffering. So for me, it's first step is to understand where we are, and then the chief has his advisory board that's already been established. It's 20 residents from all aspects of the city, and very diverse and so on. And I think that's a group where we can start, where the police department can start and having a dialogue and getting feedback and ideas and so on. So I think we have some tools. We have an equity manager in the city that also can get engaged. So I think we have the tools to start digging into this and getting to the bottom of certain things, and then moving forward. It's it's a challenge, and it's a problem that it's so many different jurisdictions involved. You know, the school board and the city council are totally different jurisdictions, different money, different school board is a state organization, and we're not really tied the same way. So there's a lot of those institutional differences that we also need to figuring out how we're going to navigate and get a better system.
Can I say one thing in response
Please.
to that, Colin?
Yeah.
I just want to encourage you, Mayor, to really look into the incredible brilliance that you have in Culver City. I think you're in a unique position because you have people in your city who have been doing this work for a lot longer than we've been having these conversations openly. And there is sometimes this idea, like, I'll just be frank, there are different factions in Culver City where 4.5 square miles or 5 square miles of people who seemingly live on opposite ends of the world because their views are so vastly different. And if we really want to take Culver City into a place where we can all be proud of what we represent, I would encourage you to, you know, open your door to have conversations, like genuine, authentic conversations with members of CCAN, the Culver City Action Network, the Democratic Club. You have Kelly Halido Hernandez, who lives right in Culver City, and she's a professor of African American Studies and Urban Planning at UCLA, and she's the director of the Ralph Bunche Center. And then you also have Pedro Noguera, who is a distinguished professor of education and the new dean of USC School of Education. So these people live in Culver City. They are residents who share in this, you know, envisioning of a better Culver City. And so I would just encourage you to feel, you know, brave enough to reach outside of the usual four walls of the people that you tend to work with. And I personally appreciate the support that you gave to the Equity and Human Relations Working Group, and that committee was passed, and I'm grateful for the conversations that you and I had leading up to that. So continue to branch out to these people that may not be the first people that we think of, but have some incredible knowledge on this and can bring some solutions to the table that I think would really help our city grow and develop in incredible ways.
Absolutely, and you know, as I usually tell everyone, I take meeting with anyone, and people know that. You know, I don't try to avoid that. I try to learn. I might not agree, but it's always better to have a dialogue and learn. And then maybe there is some solution coming out of it that everyone is sort of satisfied with. It wasn't the best, but that actually is something that works. But I also think that the Chiefs Advisory Board of Residents is a very diverse group, and they actually have a representative from all these different fractions in our city. And you're right, there are a lot of fractions, but I always have my door open. You were here a couple of times in my office, and we had the discussions and about how to go forward with the equity committee. I think we came out of that fairly well. We have something, we're going to move forward. So anyone that's online, you can just, send me an email, call me. I take meeting with anyone and listen.
So I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and then we'll get back to the policy question, because I do think ultimately, and I believe Summer was the first one to mention it, that the policy, at any level, it's kind of along the lines of the bold print giveth, but the fine print taketh away. The policy lays the foundation, and I know I've had conversations not only with the chief, but with other folks in the city, and when you are able to enforce code or enforce the law, whatever it states, that's essentially the purpose of law enforcement. And so the question, and this was actually a question that was posed in the chat, so there was a couple of direct questions. So the first one is for the chief, and it's tied to budget, as far as has there been any work done or conversation internally at looking at ways that you might be able to reallocate funds if that is the direction that's decided?
I appreciate the question. There has been an incredible amount of conversation about that. Quite frankly, I've spent nearly my entire week working on that alongside city staff, city manager's office, and our chief finance officer. Case in point, made a recommendation on what I believe to be some initial movements of things that I feel that we can do now, still sustaining those vital service levels that I think are important and we want to continue to try to maintain and preserve. And that should be going before the city council this Monday. And then there's already going to be some movement there. And then there's going to be more work. I think as we start to identify what mechanisms are in place and what our plan is going forward with some of these different social services, we can continue to identify some other places where that we can in turn within the police department scale back our need to be a part of that, or to a lesser degree, or maybe in some cases altogether, and in turn being able to facilitate more cuts and maybe eliminate some more positions and free up more funds to redirect them and reallocate them appropriately. But again, I want to beat a dead horse. The idea that some of that has to be fleshed out, and I think that's where I come back to that idea of a measured approach. I don't know that we're in a place right now that we can just start slashing our budget and eliminating, a third or just large chunks of our budget, because I honestly think that will do more harm than good. And I think in part that I think there's some of these mechanisms, some of which I spent some time working on. Councilmember Lee spoke at the last meeting regarding some of those social services and ones that we use to some degree to service some of our seniors in the community, but looking to expand that. And we're working on it, and I think we're going to be successful in being able to reallocate some funds coming from the police department's budget to be able to grow that contract, grow those services, and I think that's a good start. And there's naturally going to be some challenges that come from that, whether it's the police department, fire department, our involvement, what that social service, which I think is SSG, could provide, and what they're going to need from us, whether it's PD, FD, and to what degree that need, what that looks like. But most poignant to answer, that's going to be going before council, already some movement that I think is important to be made. And I feel safe in saying that'll just be the beginning. There'll be other areas that we're going to look at. I know one of the things that's also going before council for some consideration and some policy direction will be to, I believe, create a task force that I certainly will include the police department and maybe some other entities with city staff or whatnot, to continue that work, to take a deep dive look at the police department and certainly our budget, but even greater than that, how we're allocating our resources, where we can maybe redirect those efforts and in turn those resources to either other departments within the city, contract services, or just different social services, and how we're going to address some of the things that previously, quite frankly, ultimately fell in the police department and we were taking the lead on. And I think we, as I've stated before, and I think the other panelists have talked about, that's not the best approach. So again, it's a matter of continuing to identify what those things are, getting some other mechanisms in place that maybe are more well equipped to deal with those challenges, and then go forward with, redirecting those funds. But some of that's in the works, and that's going to be a continued effort.
Thank you very much. Somewhat along the same lines, and this is split for both the chief and for Summer. Summer, I know that you're here in a civilian or residential capacity, but you knew there was going to be a question eventually tied to your role on the school board. So the question for Summer is, what are your thoughts with in regards to SROs and PD's relationship with the school system, and are there ways that can be improved? And then while you're waiting and thinking, Chief, the question is, I guess in the past there's been a sense that there hasn't been as much transparency between the district or school board and other and PD. And so hearing your conversation so far has been refreshing, is what this person has stated, but they wanted to know what your philosophy is on transparency and partnership moving into the future. I'm assuming with the school district, but you can answer that on a larger scale. So we'll start with Summer, if you're ready.
So my opinion about the SRO is, I I think it's sort of part of the tradition of policing and school safety measures. We do have an SRO, and there's been discussion over the past, I don't know, the chief would know better than me, months about having an additional SRO who would be supporting the school. I do think that schools are safer when there are other measures to address the issues that we find in the schools and on the campuses. We do need counselors. Our counselors are at our secondary, so middle school and high school counselors are at 1 to 500 student ratio. It's really incredible that they're able to accomplish anything with the ratios. Same with our elementary schools, where 2 elementary schools are actually sharing a full-time counselor. So, our elementary schools run about 500 students, so it's almost about the same ratio there. And that's all directly related to our limited budgets because we are underfunded from the state. So we do what we can, but right now as a board, we are looking at finding ways that we can increase the number of dollars that we put towards counseling supports. At the same time, we're looking at potentially taking a $5 to $10 million budget cut because of COVID-19 and the effects on the state's budget. And the fact that, we have a really antiquated and dysfunctional way of measuring how states fund public schools, and it's based on a pricing index that's totally unrelated to the outcomes that we want in public education. So that's a problem all on its own. But just getting back to this point about SROs, I would love it if we didn't have to have an SRO. I would love to get to a point where the only interactions our students have with police officers are when they're coming to a career day or they're explaining to them, how they've kept the neighborhood safe or they've had a coffee and chat. And really so the answer to this question is really on the district to figure out how we can better support our staff, to better support our students, so we don't have to bring SROs or any law enforcement onto the campuses, because it is traumatizing to students who have already been told that they should fear the police when they do something wrong, even if it's an altercation that they've had on campus. It's traumatizing to that child to have to now face a police officer. And there's data that shows that, for a lot of Black boys in particular, their first encounter with law enforcement in a, punitive response or punitive situation is 12 years old. I have a 12-year-old, and, I look at him as a baby, but society doesn't always look at him in that way. And it is because of this messaging that we get about what criminals look like, what criminal behavior looks like, and who's the face of that criminal behavior. I mean, we have to be real. If we're going to have a conversation about policing in this country, we cannot have that conversation and not bring in racism, because there is a history of racism that feeds into these narratives about which neighborhoods are good, which neighborhoods are bad, who needs the most policing, and what those faces look like. And there's a ton of data to back this up. I'm not just coming off the top of my head giving my opinions about this, even though I have experienced this firsthand. I live in Culver City. I went to Beverly Hills High School, but I grew up on Watts. And I lived in Watts for many years. And then from there, we moved to what's affectionately known as the Jungle, which is the area near Dorsey High School in the Crenshaw district. And I grew up in that area during the 80s, during the height of this, the war on drugs. And I saw people dying in the streets. I lost friends to, gang violence. And people will have you believe, the media will have you believe that that was a result of just bad, neighborhoods where bad people lived. And that's not the case. I lived in those neighborhoods and I saw what was done when the appropriate resources were taken out, and the only resources that were left there was law enforcement. And so it's shifting our understanding of what it really takes to have a healthy neighborhood. We've heard of the school to prison pipeline. That actually starts with schools not having the resources to respond to, behavioral issues that may be directly linked to some kind of mental trauma, some, children with high numbers of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. And instead of being able to respond appropriately to it, our only recourse is to suspend this student. And students who are suspended have a higher rate of ending up in, custody, and that trajectory actually feeds into, what for-profit prisons have caught on to. And many of you may or may not know this, but a lot of for-profit prisons make money based on those beds being filled, and the beds are actually designed and built, more prisons are built based on third grade reading scores. And so I want to say that one more time so you guys can really understand the imperative nature of us responding to this at a local level, in hopes that it does start to branch out into a larger conversation. And this is why people are fighting in the streets, because there are people out there designing the sizes of their prisons based on third grade reading scores. And we have Black and brown communities that are not being educated to the level that they should be, because we have a dysfunctional system of funding public education in this country. So you cannot convince me with all of that information that some of this is not a product of design. People often say the system is broken, and I've heard it said many times, and I happen to agree with it. The system is not broken. It's functioning exactly how it was designed to function. But we in Culver City don't have to allow that to be the case. But it's not going to be the case only if we are really willing to take an honest look at policing in our communities, what it means for us and how we can change that, and how we can actually work with school districts, our own school district, to advocate for more money, advocate for more funding, support local measures when we have the bond measure, when we have a partial measure on the ballot, when we're fighting for schools and communities first, so that local corporations will have to be able to, will not be able to hide in loopholes. And I don't want to get too political, but at the same time, politics is people. And the politics determine where the money goes. And so when we're talking about underfunding schools, the solution to a lot of these policing issues is if we start to fund schools to the point where students can be educated and they can have a better quality of life because they have opportunities presented to them. And that alone can start to change the way we view people. So in a nutshell, I would love for us to not have SROs. If we do have SROs, I would like to, and I've already reached out to the superintendent, I would love for us to review that MOU, what it looks like and what it means for our students, and how do we protect our students, the most vulnerable ones, especially from having to be re-traumatized because of what we know their perception of law enforcement is. Thank you.
Chief, do you still remember the...
Going after Summer, man, she hits everything, so I don't even know where I go from there. I do.
And transparency and...
Starting with that, just to speak to the SRO, out of everything that, Summer touched on a lot that I think brings to me is that idea, and I can speak to this from my own personal experiences, the idea, the feeling of the emotion of the response that is elicited when, without question, some of our young folks see a police officer at the high school or at the junior high, and without question, that feeling and that response, without question, is different for probably every one of those students at that school. And some of those feelings, whether it's fear, anger, frustration, uncertainty, that really plays to me because, the SRO conversation or any of that, I think that's needless to say, a big deal. And that's something that I feel that certainly as a police department, as a community, as a site that we need to work to. I obviously take a lot of pride in being a part of this profession, and the idea that there's young women and men, even more so young women and men or men of color that have those feelings, particularly at that young age, about law enforcement is devastating to me because I was that youth not that long ago. That's a failure on so many parts. And so saying that to say that that's something that I think is important that we need to work to improve that and change that. Now, is that an SRO? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it's a part of that conversation. But that's certainly something that is of concern to me. I understand why they exist. But it's something that I think, whether it's through MBK, my brother's keeper programs, young Black achievers, things that the police department has been involved with in the past, through programs like that we improve that relation. I think that's of the most vital importance going forward through that. To the SRO, it's important to me that our school district, our community knows that this police department is there for them, and that includes a school district. I'm a parent of 2 children. It's important to me as a parent that I know that our police department is available there at a moment's notice if our schools should need them or in any fashion. And in this community, I assure you that it will be the case, and it'll continue to be the case. As far as determining whether an SRO needs to continue to be present at our schools, and that program needs to exist, and what it looks like, as Summer touched on. I think that's something that it's a conversation I've already been having as recent as yesterday with different folks at the school district. And I think that's something that needs to be fleshed out, and it needs to be an informed decision, one that obviously includes myself here at the police department, certainly the school district. It needs to be an informed decision, and make sure that we're doing something that makes sense, and ultimately, obviously, keeping our school safe, but hopefully doing what makes sense to further improving what I'm sure is a strained relationship with at least some of the parts, some of the students in our school district. So of the utmost importance to me, when we're talking about youth, and we were at a city council meeting this week, and there was a lot of youth that spoke out in that council meeting, and many of them had strong feelings about the police department. So that's something that to me has to be a focus, and has to be something that we work towards improving in any way that we can. As far as transparency, part of a broader conversation, our police department has to be transparent in any way that we possibly can. Obviously we have accountability measures in place, whether it starts with our city council, our subcommittee. We've touched on before the Chiefs Advisory Panel that, was recently formed, and will be up and going here in the next few weeks, and already have just a plate full of things that want to start working on with that group. There's other measures that are going to be in place. There's, RIPA, Racial Identity Profiling Act. That's something that now law enforcement is going to be required to do in reporting back data in regards to the folks that they stop, traffic stop, people that they're contacting on a daily basis. Department our size, law says that we don't have to be doing that until 2023. It is going to be one of my primary focuses. Is that something that we are going to get out ahead of now, and I want to see enacted sooner rather than later. I think it's an important transparency measure and speaks to a lot of things that we're doing. So needless to say, transparency has to be at the forefront and has to be at the foundation of everything we're doing. I think we have some things in place already that exist. I think there's some things that we can grow on and continue to do more of, including, my leading kind of from the front for our police department, making myself available, collaborating, whether it's with our school district, all the sectors of our community. Summer touched on whether it's a group like CCAN or some of the other, in this case, the chamber, whatever that is. Our police department has to be a willing partner in all that. That's got to start with me. And I think from that and from those relationships, we can foster and really build and improve transparency, because I will tell you that a lot of it already exists, but it's got to get better. And people have to feel that this police department's transparent, whether we are or we're not. If the perception is that we're not, then we're failing. We've got to do something better. We've got to make sure and drive it home that folks feel and understand that they have a police department that not only reflects them and the style of police work that they're looking for, and the style of police department with a philosophy that they're talking about, but it's got to be transparent. People have to feel that they can look under the hood at any time and they know exactly what's going on here. There's no secrets. There's no secret nuts and bolts here. It's a loaded topic. Like I said, I think there's a lot of things that we do already in regards to being transparent and reporting out and our engagement with the community. But we've got to grow it. There's still so much more that we can do, and it's got to be done in a collaborative manner. So, I guess I'll leave it there for now.
I appreciate that, and we're coming up on time. I figured this was going to be a topic that we weren't going to solve or come to resolution in any short conversation together, but wanted to pose kind of a parting question for each of you. And we'll go around the horn with the mayor, with Summer, and then we'll end with you, Chief. For the mayor, the parting question, obviously there are a lot of components, and, heavy lies the crown, so to speak, as far as being mayor of Culver City, and particularly during this time where we're dealing with coming out of the pandemic, and with a lot of the social, racial, and equity issues that have been in conversations for years, but are finally at a head. What would you say is a commitment that you either have made or are willing to make? Because obviously, people may tune into council, but they don't see a lot of the work that goes on behind the scenes. So there was a message that you wanted to share with everyone that's paying attention today about you personally and then collectively with the council, a commitment towards tackling some of those issues. What would it be?
Well, the council is fully engaged in all these issues and working very hard. We have another event tomorrow that's chaired by my colleague Megan Wells and Daniel Lee, who is a subcommittee for those specific issues that they're going to talk about. Councilmember Small and myself are on the police liaison subcommittee, so we work a lot with the police on all these issues. And as you see, over the last 2 meetings, we have brought, last meeting we brought a couple of suggestions and that the council passed, and now on Monday we have a suggestion to form a task force within the city to start looking at the aspects that Chief Cid has talked about. So those are commitments. And then, as I said, I just want to comment on the coming out of the pandemic. And since I'm doing all these videos about the pandemic for the city, no, we are opening up, but we are not coming out of the pandemic. So please, everyone, continue to sort of be careful. You know, you wear your masks when you're out among other people, and you wash your hands, and be, you know, be careful. We're opening up because our economy as a nation, as a state, started to suffer so much, so it started to create other issues. But we're gonna have this pandemic for at least, think about it, to Christmas. We're gonna have to live with these kind of physical distancing rules and so on, most likely up to Christmas. So we're not coming out of that. I just want to comment on that. But my commitment is, as Summer brought up, is that, you know, my door is open. I meet with everyone. And listen, and my colleagues on the council is definitely engaged in these discussions in different subcommittees and so on. We are waiting for if the task force gets going, then it's going to be much more concrete suggestions coming back to us, and the goal is that we will have most of the things by end of September, early October, most likely for discussion, and there's going to be public discussion before that. But it's a lot of it is of course driven by this task force that we're hopefully going to approve on Monday, who's going to do this review. And you've heard the chief about his ideas that he already have, and he has our support. It's also an issue where we need to figure out how we can engage with the county in a much better way than has been over the last, well, as long as I've been involved with the city.
Thank you. Let's go. I almost forgot the order that I said. I think I said Summer next. Similar question as far as a commitment. You clearly are versed in a lot of the topics from research you've done and experience as an African American in our community, and so, and your seat on the school board. So what are some commitments that you would say that you either professionally, personally, or I guess pseudo-professionally in your school board role are committing to as far as further discussions on these topics?
Well, let me start by saying, you know, earlier this week I sat in on a youth town hall with Black students who were talking primarily about their experience with police and law enforcement, and the vast majority of them on that call, many of them who are part of a scholarship league, who are, you know, heads of their classes, talked about how, you know, they fear the police. They are afraid to call law enforcement when there's a problem in their neighborhood. And similar to the reason we made Culver City a sanctuary city was because we know that there's enough, you know, research that shows that communities are not safer when people don't feel safe to defend themselves or to reach out to, you know, law enforcement when they feel like there is real danger in their neighborhood. And so my goal is to make our community safer, starting with, you know, our schools, of course. but my community reaches beyond even my city limits, even beyond Culver City. It's kind of like back in the day when they had smoking sections at restaurants. You know, you can't tell smoke to stay in one section. It kind of just goes where it goes. And that's the case with racism and bias and prejudice behavior and predatory behavior. And so looking at, you know, that in a larger perspective, you know, I'm committed to fighting and, you know, for some of these changes that seem radical to people, but are really not when you think about the end goal being to care for people, to put people first, without labels, without designations, just putting people and their safety and their well-being first. And so, you know, listening to those students and listening to other people who have talked about whatever their situation is that's made them feel safe, my goal is to sort of, not even sort of, but really dismantle those systems. And when I talk about dismantling a system, it doesn't mean that the system stops in its tracks, stops functioning. I am wholeheartedly committed to dismantling our archaic system of educating students in this country, because it does not work for a lot of people. But that doesn't mean that we can shut down schools and stop educating students. We have to continue the work of educating while dismantling those systems that don't work. And I envision, and I would love to see the same with law enforcement as a whole. It's not about completely stopping policing. Going back to the original question about defunding, it's not about having no officers on the street. It's about dismantling a system that was meant in many ways to work against certain people in the public. And so I'm committed to that. And I think anybody who really understands and cares about the community, our local community and our community at large, because we're all really global citizens, they're going to take that same approach, advocating for change. And this is harsh. It may sound harsh, and I hope none of the officers who may be listening to this take it personally, but any officer who does not do their due diligence and research defunding the police, and at the end of that research, any officer who is not willing to support defunding the police really is demonstrating that they care more about their personal well-being than the public and the community that they have sworn to protect. Because defunding the police and redirecting those funds to social services is actually a move that's meant to make everyone safer. And so I'm going to continue to advocate in every space I am in. And like I said in my introduction, I go into the Linwood jail and I talk to these women, and I regularly, weekly meet with women who are formerly incarcerated. They're still technically incarcerated because they're in group homes and they don't have their freedom. And they tell me, going to jail, going to prison, facing 30 years does not actually make you want to come out and be a better person. It actually has the opposite effect. And so if we think that we're safe by criminalizing everything and then sending forces out there to capture everybody and incarcerate everybody who is criminalized, we're actually not making our community safer. So it really is about re-envisioning what safety in our communities look like and having constant conversations and expanding our understanding of it, using the data, using the anecdotes that people share with us, listening to people, and really putting down our swords, you know, and not engaging in this back and forth where we're talking at each other, but really talking to each other. And I think that's one way that we can move forward, and I am committed to that wholeheartedly.
Thank you. What about you, Chief? Along the same line, same question.
Sure. You know, first, one of the things that I touched on when I had the opportunity to speak on Monday is, you know, I think one of the places that is important that we start, you know, in regards to, you know, policing as a profession, the law enforcement community, and certainly our police department, without question, is acknowledging our past. You know, I think although I can't go back and account for and change things that preceded me or things that happened in years past, but I think it's important that we acknowledge it. For a bunch of reasons, obviously for the massive amount of people that's impacted and affected, as well as so that we can understand and at least try to get an understanding of that past so that we can use it as a foundation to build and work forward. So I would start with that, that I think that's important. And I think as an organization as a whole, I think we do. And we're, you know, I want to ensure that folks understand that this organization absolutely has a past. Some of it, not great, not something that is positive, not something that we should necessarily be proud of. But I also would drive home the idea that this organization is not the same organization that it was 10 years ago, and certainly not the same that it was 20 or 30. And I'm confident in the fact, and I believe in the fact that it's not going to be the same organization 10 years from now either. And I think the commitment that I think folks can expect from me, and I will continue to follow, is that this police department, and certainly myself, is committed to, in light with some of the things that Summer touched on, rethinking how we police and what the best way of doing that is. And I believe that that starts with review, and again, reimagining and rethinking, and maybe to some degree unlearning what we know to be the status quo or the norm, to find a better way of doing it, because I believe that one exists. And something that's going to take collaboration with people and entities and sectors of the community that are certainly outside of this police department, and I welcome that. But we're going to continue to take a deep look at it, rethink how we do policing, how we use force, how we contact individuals, what we're a part of, what we respond to, what we don't respond to. So, it's really my commitment to build off of where we are now, and really reimagine and rethink and reevaluate where we're going as an organization, and really as a police profession, and how we best do that by still providing high level service, still keeping our community safe, but doing so understanding that in keeping that community safe, we don't also want to leave other parts of it in ruins, and have I don't want to take one step forward and take two steps back, because what are we really accomplishing? So really that commitment is to being a part of doing that rethinking, being motivated in doing so, and understanding that, it's, as we've touched on too many times today, it's a measured and thoughtful approach going forward, but it's one filled with action, and with a desire to really take step forwards in collaboration with everyone around us, to rethink it, reimagine it, and come out of this better than we came into it.
Well, I'd like to thank all three of you guys for joining me today. I have said before, the Chamber, we've tried to pride ourselves on being a catalyst of business growth and expansion, a connector of people, ideas, and resources, which you all fall into, and equally important, a champion of strong community. And so my, collective commitment from the Chamber perspective is to continue to convene these tough conversations. But personally, it's to utilize my platform. There's a lot of experience that I've had, good, bad, and indifferent, as an African-American male in this country. And, I can tell you that Monday night at council, hearing the comments all over the scale, a lot of that resonated, because I could relate to, comments on each side of it, and particularly being a parent as well. So I know we went a little bit over, and I apologize for that. But I thank you all for the three of you guys for joining me, and then the ones that were participants. You guys gave a lot of great questions. Again, look at the city's website to attend a continued conversation that'll dive specifically into institutions and racism tomorrow night, and that's with the city's ad hoc committee on, is it equality, I believe? Sorry, but it's going to be at 5 o'clock. Equity, sorry. And it's going to be at 5 o'clock tomorrow. There's information on the website. So I would encourage each and every one of you guys to get involved with as many of these discussions as possible, because the root of all this is listening. So thank you. You guys have a good rest of your nights, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.